While the world's eyes have been locked on Iran, another threat has been rising, this time from within NATO. Turkey, once a secular ally of the West, is now led by a man with imperial ambitions and Islamic alliances that rival Tehran's. I'm Doron Spielman, and this is the True East Podcast. For decades, Turkey was held up as a model, a secular, Muslim-majority NATO member, and the first Muslim country to recognize the State of Israel back in 1949. But that Turkey no longer exists. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, Turkey has undergone a total transformation, one that the West still does not fully understand. Erdogan has crushed the opposition at home, jailed his rivals, and aligned himself with the world's most dangerous Islamic movements. He hasn't declared himself a caliph, but he is acting like one. And now he's advancing a vision not just for Turkey, but for a new Ottoman empire. Erdogan isn't just aligned with radical Islamist movements, he is their key state sponsor. He supports Hamas politically and financially. He enabled the flow of ISIS fighters through Turkish territory. And now, he's backing Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Shara, a figure with the deepest ties to the remnants of ISIS. This is not just ideology. This is a strategy. In recent days, Israeli fighter jets struck the T-4 base in Palmyra, Syria, just hours before Turkish special forces were set to arrive. Israeli intelligence believes Erdogan was preparing to turn the site into a permanent rocket hub aimed at Israel's north. For years, we feared that Iran was doing this. Now, it's Turkey. To help us unpack how we got here and where all this is headed, we are welcoming back a returning guest to True East, Dr. Rhode, a dear friend. Harold spent 3 decades at the Pentagon as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense, specializing in Turkey, Iran, and the Middle East. Harold is not just a policy expert, he spent years on the ground and has a deep, unmatched understanding of Turkish history, ideology, and ambition. My dear friend Harold, welcome back to True East.
Nice to be here, Doron.
So, Harold, you didn't just spend years in an office locked away. You were on the ground in Turkey for decades. Give us a picture of what Turkey was like for you and why you first went there.
Well, first of all, I was very interested already as an early teenager in the Arab-Israeli dispute. And by nature, I'm interested in history because that's how you understand things. Someone's history, the culture, how they look at the world. And so I realized that the Ottomans, who were Turks, ruled this area from 1517 to 1917. That's 400 years. So I figured not only do I have to learn Arabic, but I got to learn Turkish. And I eventually got a PhD in Ottoman history of what is today northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and a bit of Syria. Now, I was running around this Turkey, the Middle East, already. The first time I went to Turkey was in 1968. I spent about 2 weeks. I was a sophomore or junior in college, and I was studying Ottoman history. And I learned all about the empire, and we hear about Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who conquered Istanbul, Constantinople back then in 1453. And I knew already something was wrong with even the name. Mehmed is Muhammad in Turkish. But the conqueror, we call him that in English, but he is called Fatih in Turkish, which is Fatih in Arabic. And what that means is a conqueror for Islam. And he was conquering it not as a Turk, but as a Muslim. In fact, back then, to be an Ottoman was much more important than being a Turk. Turks were the country bumpkins who didn't speak this upper class Arabo-Persian Turkish combination language called Ottoman. And I had studied this really from about Ottoman history from about 1965, 66. And I went to Turkey. I was in Israel and I took a flight. It was only $30 to go to Istanbul from Israel at the time as a student.
You should have bought extra tickets. Today it's, first of all, you can't go, but it's thousands of dollars.
Oh, it's unbelievable. But anyway, here I arrived there. It's 1968. And most of the cars in Istanbul, which maybe had 1.5 million people, today it's got over 20 million. And the cars were like from the early 1950s. And I remember that from the time I was a kid. But what was really important here is you saw that modern Turkey of that time, which was supposedly a democratically oriented secular state, which is the founder of Turkey, Kemal Atatürk, it was the 1920s he founded the state. Beforehand, you see, it's on the remnants of old civilizations. First, the Byzantines, who lost to the Turks again in 1453. And since then, you see this old civilization. You see all these monuments in Arabic letters, which Old Turkish, Ottoman Turkish was written in, that no Turk even back then could read. And you realize here are these people, they're on this path, and it's like, what's going on here? Who are we? What are we?
So they were lacking in identity, a clear identity, even in the late 60s?
Yes, but it's based on Turkish culture. Turks are originally from Central Asia. And in Central Asian culture, when there are, let's say, two tribes that are fighting, the winner tribe, what he does, when he wins, the loser tribe becomes what the winner tribe is. We hear about the Mongol invasions of Europe or Middle East and all that. We know that when the Mongols invaded here, that is, which is today Israel, that most of those soldiers only spoke Turkish. They didn't speak Mongol, but they were the losers. And so they became Mongols. So identity is really fluid. So if you go back to Turkey, Turkey was, for nationality in the late 19th century, they introduced, what do you call this in English? Identity cards. And for millet, which was nationality, the word that was listed was Islam.
Not Turkish.
No, a Turk was some weirdo living out and who couldn't read and write and wasn't cultured. Terbiyatsiz, culture without lacking culture. They were the inferior types. And now bringing that in touch with Erdogan, Erdogan grew up in that culture, the country bumpkin culture. He grew up in a place which was called Fatih, the same thing, Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed the Islamic conqueror, if you wish. That neighborhood was named where he grew up in Istanbul, dirt poor. His education was totally in Islamic things. Anybody who did secular things at the time, which a very small elite in Turkey did, it was tiny. And Erdogan grew up this way. He felt discriminated against. He, if I may say so, I didn't know him, so I can't say hated secularism. He hated Atatürkism, which was to separate religion from the state. And in Islam, the state exists in Islam to propagate Islam. And that should give you some ideas of what Erdogan is doing today. And the thing which is so important in the Middle East is patience. And he grew up, and there is nothing he could do as he was growing up except internalize that hatred over and over again of secularism and, I want to say, Western culture.
So I want to ask you a question with that secularism. And first of all, for our listeners, I'm not sure that everyone knows that the Turks are not Arabs.
Oh my God, no. God forbid you should tell them that. You know what? You want to know what the Turks say about Arabs? Now watch this. When all of a sudden Arabs began to come to Istanbul for vacations, and you get into a taxi cab and you ask a Turk what they think of an Arab. Now remember, modern Turkish is written with Latin letters from left to right. And so Arabic is written from, like Hebrew, right to left. So the word for Arab is Arap, a P on the end, a B at the end in Turkish is a P. Arap, and you read it backwards, it's para. Para is money. So Arap para. Or they would have another thing they would say. The Turkish insults about Arabs are unbelievable.
So the meaning is that they're visiting Turkey and we just want to take their money? Is that the idea?
if I can be blunt, and I am not sure we can edit things out if necessary, they in the Middle East, when you get married, and let's say your activity beforehand is quite limited, the idea of having a girlfriend for a guy, he has, let's say, other outlets, and they're prostitutes. Well, what happened is the Arabs would come, and they had all the money in the world, and they'd raise the price of prostitutes. How do I know this? Is because I talk with, I speak Turkish. And so I would talk with the taxi cab drivers, and they had a lot of other awful things to say about Arabs. There is zero love between them from a Turkish point of view. And the Arabs don't like Turks.
Well, let me ask you, the secular elite in Turkey, was that associated with the pro-Israel side of the country? I mean, how was Turkey with Israel back in the 60s and 70s?
Turkey didn't care about Israel. Yes, the secular elite was, it wanted, if anything, not to identify with the Muslim world. I'll tell you of a little symphony story. I mean, all these upperclassmen would go to Western symphonies and things. And here you had a bunch of soldiers who were out in the East, and the East is totally like the rest of the village Arab world. It's very, the Turks would say, primitive and backward. That is the educated, the secular whatever. And this is, I mean, I saw this myself in a movie. The army, which was totally protective of Ataturk's secular republic, would go into a poor village. And the Turks there, the villagers, were playing music, all sorts of Turkish music, which is completely different from Western music. And the Turkish military says, you shouldn't be playing that. You should be playing Beethoven and Brahms. So the Turks very silently just stop, and then they start playing Beethoven and Brahms on their traditional instruments. Now, that sounds like it's a combination, and that could be good. But I think I'd like to describe Turkey at that time with what a famous Turkish poet, how he described Turkey, and I think it'll make sense to us. He described Turkey as a boat, a huge boat, where the crew was steering the boat full speed ahead westward to join NATO, the Western world, and all that, while the boat, which is the people and huge, was going full speed ahead eastward. I think I've described Turkey under Ataturk pretty well.
So you're saying that the people of Turkey, even back then, were heading more towards the east, more towards traditional values, and it was a small group of elites that were heading towards the west. And when did that begin to unravel?
Now it comes to the question of population. How many people are what? Now, if it's a small elite, they didn't have many children, but the villagers and all that did. And they simply overwhelmed the system with time. And let me give you an example. According to Turkish law, a man can only have one wife. But all the children were registered in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the father's internal document, its identity card. And lo and behold, believe it or not, remember, one wife, there was a child born, let's say in January, let's arbitrarily say of 1963, and he had another child in March of 63. And they're all, of course, registered legally under the first wife. Now, she was kind of really active, a different type of woman than maybe in the rest of the world. What he did was he had his city wife and he had his country wife and other wives, but they weren't legally registered like that. Mm-hmm. This is Turkey.
So the
contrasts.
There was a demographic change. When did, from your experience, the Turkey that we think of as a secular Turkey leaning more towards the West, relationship with Israel, when did you identify the tipping point that it began to change?
Maybe I could tell another story. It's a military story. The question is, did the elites even know what was going on? Could they know what is going on? Now, I want to tell you, in every Turkish military officer's office, Behind him was a sign which said in Turkish, "The commander wants answers. He doesn't want questions." They wouldn't do well, shall we say, in a Talmud class. So what happens? I'm at when I was already working at the Pentagon on Turkish things and Middle East things, whatever. I was at a dinner, a fancy dinner, a diplomatic dinner. By the way, they're not interesting, Doron. The real world is out with the taxi cabs and the people. They know what's going on in their country. It's not all these fancy surveys. Anyway, I'm talking with this 3-star Air Force general. This is 1980s. I asked him about fundamentalism in the Turkish military. Now, remember, the Turkish military was the protector of the secular Republic of Turkey. He said, "We have none." I said, and this is a very Turkish thing, what I'm about to do. I said, tell me, do you have a sign in your office which says the commander wants answers, he doesn't want questions? And you could see a change in his face because he realized he was going down a rat's hole. He said, "Yes." I said, you have a 4-star, you're a 3-star. Do you tell your 4-star things he doesn't want to hear? Silence. I said, when you were a 2-star, did you tell your 3-star in your position things he didn't want to hear? He said, you could just see the face. He was like withdrawing. I said, well, if that's the way the system works, nothing is passed up. How do you really know if there is anything, if there's not fundamentalism in there? And remember, in the Middle East, they have patience. They know how to wait. The next day, we were at the airport. This was in a place called Izmir on the coast of Turkey, and there's still a few Jews left there. We're getting on the small plane and going to Ankara. And all the Americans, the engines of the plane are already working and making noise. And all the Americans have head earphones on so that to deaden the noise. But no Turks are manly. They wouldn't dare. So they didn't hear after a while, let's say. Anyway, out of nowhere, I see someone's pulling my shirt, my coat, whatever I was wearing. And he says to me, "Can I speak with you for a moment?" It's the guy I had dinner with the night before. He said, "Harold Bey, you are Doron Bey." Bey is, they don't use last names. Doron Bey, he said to me, "Harold Bey, I don't know the answer to your question about fundamentalism. And what is worse is I don't know how to know." Well, what did I do? There was a religious book ministry at the time funded by the Wahhabis, the Saudis. The Saudis have a very different approach today. I can explain that, but it's not part of the Turkey story. And they were funding the religious ministry. So I would go into the religious ministry bookstore and buy books. I wanted to know what they were selling. First of all, the quality of the books. Turkish quality back then of books was terrible. But the religious bookstore was magnificent from the Turkish Ministry of Religion, which means Islam.
So a secular government had a religion, a ministry of religion that was pushing Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia. Explain to me how this works.
Well, number one, they thought they could control it. That is the military, basically. They thought they could control it by having a ministry of religion, and they would have the textbooks. And it's true that they had textbooks, but the ministry of religion got all sorts of fundings from other places. At that time, from Libya, at that time, from Saudi Arabia. Again, it's a different world today. And the books were viciously anti-American, viciously anti-Western in general, viciously anti-Semitic. You can add viciously in anything which we think is a good thing.
So this was percolating beneath the surface.
Yes.
And the upper leadership, without any questioning, was misreading the movements and what was happening inside the military.
100%.
And how did Erdogan come to power?
Well, at first, he worked his way up and he became mayor of Istanbul, which is the largest and most important city, not the capital, that's Ankara, in Turkey.
The same position he just arrested and jailed
Yes.
a month ago, which we'll talk about.
Imamoglu. Yes. Now, he knew these fanatic radical Muslims know exactly that we worship this word in Western language. It's called moderate. And Erdogan did not want problems with the United States or with Europe. So he presented what appeared to be moderate face. And the Americans were so happy because we have moderate Muslims to deal with. There is no such thing. Erdogan would say, very simple, when you asked him, he says, there's no moderates, there's no extremists, they're just Muslims. Islam is Islam. Now, you realize that opens up to Islam is not one thing, it's a billion things. There are 1.4 billion if there are 1.4 billion Muslims. They don't even agree exactly what Islam is. But he slowly but surely and patiently worked his way up. He had been a member of a political party in the late 90s by a man by the name of Erdogan, who decided to, a fanatically Islamist, that is radical party. And he tried very quickly to re-Islamify Turkey, bring Islam into the public sphere. And their military had what they call an E-coup. E is like email. And made him resign. And Erdogan learned from that experience that you have to do it yavaş yavaş, slowly, slowly, as they say in Turkish. And besides, you have the Americans. And believe me, from my experience, Americans are desperate to find moderates of everything. Moderate murderers. I guess a moderate Nazi would have only killed 1 million Jews. Moderates. We love moderates. And they presented.
So he duped the
Yes.
U.S. and he duped I mean, you were part of the the intelligence atmosphere in the United States.
No, I was not part of the intelligence community. Did not like me because I have my own views, and they were based on all the years that I ran around the Middle East as a poor student, living a life in Iran, in Turkey, and in the Arab world. Some countries, Jews couldn't go to many countries in the Arab world at that time. And I lived with the people, and I had a very different approach than a lot of the people in the intelligence world who a few years ago were working on Fiji. Now they're dealing with Turkey. You can't do this. You need to live and breathe this. By the way, the Soviets and the Chinese are excellent at that. They have people who study different cultures, and when they go out on so-called diplomatic missions, they go back and forth and back and forth. And they know these cultures like the back of their hand. We in the United States, and I must tell you, Israeli diplomats are no different. They're not. They don't do this. They're not masters of the culture that they're coming to. If you don't know the culture, you don't know how to ask good questions. And
so let's drill down, Harold. Like, what was the difference, and what were you saying in those years that Erdogan was putting on a moderate position to the West? What was your voice saying that the intelligence community wasn't thrilled with?
They didn't agree with me.
What were you saying?
That we are experiencing in Turkey and in other places, but specifically in Turkey, an Islamic revival. And by the way, I must tell you, in all fairness to some, not most, of the people who were interested in Turkey before, they asked me, how did I know? Because we saw what happened. And frankly, it's much worse than it appears, even right now. I said, all I did was live with the people. Let me just give you an example. There were all these sophisticated polls of who was going to win this election or that election, because Turks had free and fair, whatever that is, elections. And I didn't agree with these sophisticated pollsters. Why? Because, for example, when people came from the American government for formal visits, they went and bought rugs, and they bought them in all the rich, beautiful rugs, very expensive. And that's not where Hulk means sha'bi or amcha in Hebrew. It means the common man. That's not where the common man was. But I had a guy that the Americans looked down on. They called him Cheap Charlie. And all the rugs that we have at home basically are from that time. They're the ones that Turks would have at home. Now, when there were elections, I knew these guys very well. And what happened? I would ask them who's going to win, and they never were wrong. And all the great posters that the American government and the Israeli government were so interested in, and the Europeans were wrong. Now, I brought that up I said, you see what's in the newspapers. You say you said something different. You always are right on this. Why are you right all the time? And they said, Chalk, I live with the people. I'm people.
So what happened when you go back to the Pentagon and you're dealing with real Turks, and from what I understand from you, the diplomats are dealing with that secular elite which own the fancy stores, and you're feeling the pulse of the population. What answer did you get?
Frankly, and it's not comfortable to talk about that, I was a threat to them.
Okay.
And they didn't want to hear this. It wasn't, see, it's like, why do you think the State Department, where do you think it gets its information on the country called Israel, one of the most open societies in the world? From a newspaper called Haaretz, which so many people that I know here who are not even rightists call El Ard, which means in Arabic, it's the Palestinian newspaper printed in Hebrew.
Right. It's the most left-wing public news source in Israel.
And the same thing, they're with the Kaplan crowd here. It's the same story. Oh, listen, but
the Kaplan crowd, just explaining, being the protesters that are associated with
very small group of people who have a lot of money and a lot of PR. That's what happened in Turkey as well.
So, Harold, at what point would you say did Erdogan kind of remove the facade and reveal? Can you point to a point at which you say, okay,
no,
people in the West realize, because today we all realize we're dealing with a fanatic, Islamist that speaks about, the next Ottoman Empire.
Imagine that you're looking at a cup under a leaky faucet, drip by drip by drip. And it's happening so slowly that there's just the tiny drips. But maybe by tomorrow morning, the cup is full. And when did you know? Well, someone like myself who is trained to think as the other side thinks, looks for different things, asks different questions. There were, as I said, a few people that asked, how did you know?
Tell me, the Muslim Brotherhood, what impact does that have on Erdogan?
Okay, what is the Muslim Brotherhood? I'm forgetting its history. How is it organized? The answer is it's not. It is amorphous. It is something that we can't figure out in the West. There are people, Hamas, do they have, they're part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Why? Because they say so. Do we know numbers? We can't know numbers. Yes, it's originally an Egyptian movement. And Erdogan sees himself very much in that same line. The Muslim Brotherhood, and they did this in America as well, they're ISIS. They are Al-Qaeda, but they call themselves by a different name. Doron, I hate you. God forbid, we're friends. And so I want to get you. And I know, if you'll excuse me, you're dumb enough that you don't like what I am. I'm a Al-Qaeda guy. And all of a sudden, I say, Doron, I was wrong. I realized Al-Qaeda was wrong. It isn't. I'm ISIS now. And you know what? The name changes, but it's exactly the same thing. And that's what happened when Erdogan sent his guys that he trained and armed in Syria. And the guy that we're calling the president of Syria today, he was appointed by America, America actually doesn't recognize him, so that's wrong. I think, if I'm correct, that he was fighting the American troops in Iraq and got arrested. He was there for 5 years. And now we're going to deal with him? I'm sorry. These are people who want no good for things that you and I hold dear, the United States of America and Israel. And if Europe ever wakes up to being European again, Europe.
So is this the answer to why Erdogan seems to have, unwound the the Turkish-Israel relationship? I mean, I remember flying to Turkey. with my family years ago, and I felt very welcomed, incredibly comfortable. Was it strategic? Was he trying to make a point? Is he answering to his population, or is this true ideology?
All of the above. Please, the people, Erdogan speaks their language. In English, if you give let's say a classroom of 50 students and you ask them to write down the definition of secularism, you'll get pretty much the answer from all the same students, because it rings to us true. In the Middle East, there's really not a concept of secularism as we understand it, and that includes Turkey. It is that the best translation is worldliness. Alam in Arabic is world, one of the words for world, like olam,
similar to Hebrew.
Or dunya, which the word din comes from, where there is law. And so it's either dunyawiya, which is Arabic, or ulmaniya. And that means, let's call it it means worldliness. Now I go back to that class of 50 students and I said, now define for me worldliness. You'll get 50 different definitions because no one knows what it means. There isn't, it could mean anything. Sugary candies are eaten everywhere in the world. That's worldly. It's absurd.
So Erdogan is walking into kind of an open marketplace where things are not defined, and he begins to define the Israel relationship. And of course, I remember we had the Mavi Mara, which was the flotilla, which was really the breakdown, I think, at least from my perspective, in the Turkish relationship. I was in the army at the time as a spokesperson. And why did he reverse? I mean, there was a strategic element to that relationship regarding the United States. He lost something, I would think.
Forget the United States here. He, as you in the introduction so beautifully said, he is trying to reestablish if you wish, the Ottoman Empire. We don't have to call it the Ottoman Empire. Turkey was the center of the Sunni world, which is maybe 85 to 88, who knows, percent of the Muslim world. We don't know how many Muslims there are, and we don't know exactly the percentage. Shiites are only 200-300 million people out of 1.4 billion. Anyway, what he wants to do is reestablish Turkey, Istanbul, as the center of the Sunni world. And that includes the entire, because the Shiites are wrong. Now, let's bring this back to Erdogan. Why Mavi Marmara? Here's the problem. What he is doing is he's in a fight in the Sunni world over who should rule the Muslim world. Either, let's call it the Muslim Brotherhood view, the Erdogan view, or let's say, like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, the Saudis today, not back then, who understand that the Brotherhood, which the Saudis at one time funded, not today, they absolutely nothing. These extremists, if you wish, are basically want to take over the Muslim world. And they, especially the Gulfis, that is the UAE, the Emiratis, they see as Iran is a threat. But even after Iran is over, let's say, God willing, it's a new regime there and it doesn't want to get involved in everybody else's problems, the regime, then they're worried about something which in the end is much more dangerous for them. And that is the extremist radical Muslims, which Erdogan is totally part of.
I remember, Harold, I have to tell you, in 2007 at the City of David, where I spent 20 years in the excavations, we were told by the then mayor, Lipoliansky, mayor of Jerusalem, and then Shimon Peres followed up with this in news reports. And even most recently, we heard President Herzog thinking Israel's most important inscription ever found in the City of David, the Siloam inscription, right? Which details for our listeners, King Hezekiah, King David's great-great-grandson, his excavation of a tunnel in the City of David where he diverted the water of the ancient city of Jerusalem into a safe place, so that when Assyria attacked ancient Jerusalem, they couldn't find the water. And that is both described in the Bible and described in this inscription. And we were told that the inscription was coming back to Jerusalem, and all of a sudden it wasn't. And we understood it was Erdogan. Can you, and this of course is in my book.
Yeah, this is a marvelous book. I heard your interview that you did on this. It's one of the greatest books that I think has been written already on this city, Jerusalem, and the old city of David.
I'll take the opportunity, by the way, to let our listeners know, as if this is not an open plug, that this is my book, When the Stones Speak. And the book is going to be available May 13th in the United States. And we're speaking about it now. And in the book, I describe how we were about to have, we thought, you may feel differently, that we were about to get that inscription sent from Turkey back to Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden it disappeared. What's the real story behind that?
This is, as I understand it, in Turkish, just as it is in Arabic, it's offensive to say no. It's even worse in Iran. But the one we know in life, many times we want to say no. But I mean, God forbid, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say something awful about your book, and I have nothing but praise from what I know of it. I can't say that, so I will pretend. And now I can even apply this to what I worked with when I was working at the Pentagon. We listened to the words. We didn't listen to the culture. They sort of said maybe in this, and I don't remember the exact words, but you got to realize that this territory, Israel today, is from a Muslim point of view. It was captured in 637, 638, CEAD, whatever you prefer. And once it's captured, it has been entered into Islam, and it's Muslim forever. That's, of course, what Erdogan thinks. Don't give me this Bible stuff. It matters to you and to me.
So giving back the Siloam inscription, which proves that the Jews have been around for, I mean, the inscription itself was written in 800 BC. So that's 1400 years before Islam was founded. So I guess the Muslim Brotherhood wouldn't be willing to give us back something that proves that we were here first.
Please, look.
I guess we were naive.
Well, let me explain why, among other things, the naivete. There's a phrase in Hebrew, Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. And all of us Jews know, and the Christians know, that's the Jewish people of today. We are their descendants. The Arabic and the Quran is filled with references to Bani Israel. And there's a whole tradition where people have studied below the Israeliyat, the stuff about Israelism, the children of Israel.
It appears 40 times in the Quran.
Jerusalem doesn't appear once, but that does.
Bnei Israel,
exactly.
The children of Israel, correct.
Right. Okay, so what's the point here? How do the Muslims square the circle? We Jews today are not descendant of those Bani Israel. Those Bani Israel were Muslims from their point of view. And so they died out at some point. We have the same name, but it's a very different thing.
So the Siloam inscription, and in fact, that's what the book is very much written about. According to them, all this archaeology is a very, very inconvenient truth for us that we are establishing as the indigenous people. But for them, it completely goes against this narrative. So they're pushing this narrative. Does the average Turk, you think, buy into this narrative?
First of all, they don't know anything about it. It's like in America today, you hear people, these so-called students are yelling from the river to the sea, whatever. Well, you ask them what river and what sea, they haven't a clue.
They have no idea.
The Turks have no idea. It isn't that. It is pre-Islamic. The word basically in Sunni Islam for pre-Islam things is in Arabic, Jahiliyyah, and it's a similar form in Turkish. And what it means is the period of ignorance. Anything before Islam is of no concern. Now, here's the problem of squaring the circle again. Well, if there is before Islam, as you described, 400 years before, then it would mean that it's either the period of ignorance, so it's obviously worthless. So whether it's true or not in ours is completely irrelevant because we aren't the descendant of Bani Israel. No, please, I don't buy what I'm saying, but I'm telling you, if anything, that's what they
think. So you have Turkey today, led by Erdogan, who holds a view that the ancient people of Israel are not connected to the Jews today, despite the archaeology, the religion, the DNA evidence, and it's not, because ignorance is bliss, which also, of course, has implications on Christianity.
Of course.
Which has enormous implications on Judeo-Christian values, which the founding fathers of the United States of America built the country on.
Yes.
He's supporting ISIS. He's supporting Hamas.
Yes.
He's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Member, whatever. He's part of the Muslim.
Part of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And here's the crazy thing, Harold, I just don't get it. He's a member of NATO. So what are all of the NATO countries doing with the next leader of Iran and the next Iran on the world stage? As soon as Iran's out of the picture, Turkey's going to pop right up and try to consolidate the same power. What are they doing? They looking the other way? Explain to me.
Their head is in the sand or in the ground because they're afraid. And here's the proof. Let's just take Europe. Already in the early 80s, my knowledge of German isn't particularly good, but my knowledge of Turkish is pretty good. And back then it was extremely good. So I'm in Germany running around talking with the Turks, and I can't really, well, Germans I'll speak English with if they know English. And the Turks that were there, I was asking the Germans about the Turks. Well, we'll accept them, but they have to stop cooking with their spices, stop having this loud, weird music, and they can't have so many children. That's what the Germans were saying about it. I said, you don't understand what is going on there. They have patience, just like Erdogan. They are quiet. They stay to themselves until they reach critical mass, and then they will use your laws against you. And they did. And to bring this back to the secular establishment in Turkey, there was the German law of teaching Islam, and they've got formally, it's probably 4 or 5 million Muslims in Germany today. And they are therefore entitled to have religious classes in German schools that cannot be funded by the government. The Turks, when this started, basically, it was back in the early 80s, the Turks asked the Turkish government, the secular Turkish government at the time, can we please supply books, religious books, for the Turks here? Because if we don't, you're going to have problems. Meaning other people, well, and they'll be the extremists. And the government, the German government said, no, you cannot have the government involved in religious things. So the Turks I remember them being beside themselves. So who stepped in? Again, they changed names and all that. So the Saudis and the Libyans at the time were funding different books, not the, at the time, shall we say, peaceful, sort of a peaceful Islam. Islam is not peaceful religion. They kill each other.
So you're talking about the percolation
Yes.
over time of Islam. But now
all
today,
over Europe and in the United States, the same thing is happening now.
But to focus back on Turkey, and in a minute I want to bridge really to Israel, what's happening today in Israel. This is fascinating. In Turkey, where this has been percolating for years, and Erdogan has brought this now all the way to the next level. And it's clear in the eyes of the world. And he is incredibly close with Iran. He's close with Russia. He's close with China. And he's a member of NATO. Can NATO not do anything? Is the ship sailed?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question. It gets even worse. You know, he's allied with Russia, but he goes on and he hates the Russians for having taken Crimea. Why? Because it's originally Crimean Tatar, Muslim, Turkic. The Tatars are Turks. And so you've got all this hodgepodge. And again, Doron, it comes back to the same thing. How do you see yourself? And Erdogan is basically, he doesn't want these people to assimilate in Germany or in France or wherever they are. Why? Because eventually they're going to take over, and they are taking over.
I want to talk for a moment about Palmyra in Syria. Just a few days ago, Israeli jets struck a army base there, a military base, took out an entire base just before Turkish special forces arrived at that base, which according to Israeli intelligence has become public. They assumed that Turkey was going to be establishing a military base there with long-range rockets that could strike northern Israel. And Israel took it out just before they got there. Now, this sounds like something that we would have been thinking about Iran, right? Until recently, this is a move that Iran would have done. Now, we're assuming that Turkey's slowly moving into the footsteps of Iran. Do you think that they're a more valid threat today than Iran, or are they on their way? And And
What's a threat meter? How do you measure a threat? They're a different threat. And for Israel, after the Iranian nuclear program is taken care of, let's say, the Turkey becomes a real problem. And I'm not sure that the United States understands how Israel sees what is happening in Syria and what Erdogan's people are doing in Syria. I don't care if they say they're different and if they shave and they didn't shave before and they wear suits instead of I don't care, whatever. The Islamic garb. They're still the same people inside. There's no difference. And what the guy in Syria, this Jolani Ahmed Shara, what is he doing? He's following the Erdogan prescription of being nice, saying nice things, just as Erdogan did. But the time will come. And you see that there are two things that he's doing. One, of course, encouraged by Turkey, by Erdogan and company, which is you're doing nice to the world. And the other is when we're not following this. I'm watching what he's doing on his Islamic Council. They are bringing Sharia, Muslim holy law, back into Syria big time.
You know, Harold, you've been deep inside the defense establishment. Just last week at the press conference, Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed to President Trump concerns about Turkey, exactly about what you're saying, their infiltration into Syria. They're supporting a regime that's clearly Ahmad al-Sharia connected to ISIS or Islamic State. And Trump's answer, and I'll just read it, was, Bibi, if you've got a problem with Erdogan, I can work it out. Now, what does that statement tell you about how DC, about how Washington is, reading Erdogan, and what happens if Trump's guarantees don't hold?
Trump is a magnificent negotiator for Westerners. Yes, he's had non-Westerners. I'm not an expert on Trump. But in the Middle East, things are done differently. And we're right now in this period of so-called negotiating with Iran, and everything's going nicely. I remember you asked me, what did the people in the Pentagon say when we would go to meetings in Turkey and I'd come back and everything looked good? I said, no, you will find out in a month that everything they promised you ain't going to happen. The same is true. The Iranians, whatever the rest of the Middle East are, they're the most sophisticated people in the Middle East, and they can look you right in the face and lie and smile. And I don't know how Trump is going to square the circle here. And if he thinks he can apply American techniques, negotiating techniques, there is one thing that Trump does know to do in the end. You're going to create a problem for me, and if you're lying to me and you're whatever, what did he do to al-Baghdadi? Baghdadi, they call him in English. What did he do to Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian, and then the other, was he ISIS? I don't, they're all whatever. In the end, Trump used force. Here in the Middle East, the only way you're taken seriously is, number one, do you have the ability to enforce your will? But more importantly, number two is important, and that is, do you have the will to impose your what you want to do? If the answer to that is, all of a sudden, I'm your servant, Doron. Otherwise, I'm already looking for ways to get around you. I do not know Trump. I just don't know the people directly around him. I know that he did this in the past. I'm a historian. Just because you did something in the past doesn't mean you're going to do it again. But I only will hope that when he sees what the reality is, that he will do what he's doing to the Houthis.
Erdogan right now is facing the biggest challenge to his premiership, presidency, rule over Turkey ever. Just in the middle of March, you had massive protests in the streets against Erdogan. From what I could see, there was an entire football stadium that looked to be filled with hundreds of thousands of people. He arrested, this was in response to arresting the mayor of Istanbul. From what you're seeing, is there a chance that Erdogan's grip on power is slipping? And what could this mean?
The answer is yes and no, which is a non-answer, and I know that.
You've been in the Middle East a long time, Harold.
I'm 75 years old and been doing this since I'm 14. Yeah. And here is the idea of losing grip on power. Bernard Lewis, the greatest professor of Middle East in the late 20th century, in the first decade of the 21st century, used to say, it doesn't matter whether you're Democratic, this, that, or whatever, that the state is your estate. The people who take it over, it is their fiefdom, and they do with it what they want. There is no doubt that there is enormous dissatisfaction in Turkey today with Erdogan. The economy is in shambles. A lot of people who are more religious, more radical than him, are suffering galore. People would go into the supermarket and they would buy a pumpkin. And if you would ever say you buy a half of a pumpkin, the people would be ashamed. Now they're buying quarter of pumpkins. That's all they can afford. It's not the religion thing here. There are many other reasons that people are dissatisfied with Erdogan. Now, this guy, Imam Olu, there's a G in both of them, which Imam Oglu it looks, or Erdogan, but it's not pronounced. And Imam Olu is
the mayor of Istanbul.
Mayor of Istanbul. And remember, that's where Erdogan was before the mayor, the most important city in Turkey. He arrested him. How did again, there are other countries in this part of the world who use laws or play with laws and all of a sudden invent things and say we have a right to discuss anything. You must have a degree from a university to be the mayor of in politics in Turkey at any type of important level. And all of a sudden they took away, Erdogan's people took away from the university, a very good university, Imam Ulu's degree from that university. So now he doesn't have a degree after 20 some odd years. I don't know what it is, some 20, 30 years, whatever. And so he can't be mayor of Istanbul anymore. This is, I own the state, Erdogan. I decide what is happening. He's got a lot of forces that he can use. There is no doubt that the unrest in Turkey is huge and serious. That doesn't work like in Iran.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in Iran, put it this way, if you can I watched this, I lived through the Iranian Revolution. I was going to university in Iran during that time. Once the regime was powerless, once the Shah was unwilling to do what was necessary to keep himself in power, for whatever reason, that's when the revolution gathered steam. A revolution didn't take place in a day. It was a process of months and months and months. I lived through the early and mid stages there. In Turkey, the question is, as long as Erdogan is capable of using the forces of Turkey, the police, it doesn't matter what it is, to keep himself in power, it's likely that and we got, listen, but the riots are going out, they're not riots, they're demonstrations. And Imam Ulu for the West is a much better candidate to run Turkey. But I want to tell you something which is extremely, extremely important. There are a lot of young people, educated young people. There are a lot more educated people in Turkey than there were back when I first started to go to Turkey. And these people hate Erdogan, and they call themselves, we're no longer Muslims. The pain for that, by the way, in Islam is death. But we're theists. We believe in God. Now, beforehand, those same people hated Israel because Israel stole Muslim land from their point of view, from a Muslim point of view. What scares me, or what if I were Israel, I would also worry about in the long run, is a lot of these young people who support Imam Ulu, a change in Turkey, and there's no doubt they want to get along with the West. But a lot of them hate Israel as well. Why? Because Israel is imperialist, it's racist, it's all these other garbage liberal terms, woke terms. And so what remains the same, it doesn't matter whether you're religiously this, that, or the other. It matters your culture. Islam is a culture. It's not only a religion. If it all was how you worship God, who cares? That's their business. But it's not. it invades or it permeates is the better word, every section of Turkish life. And so for all of a sudden, fine, I don't care about I don't care about Allah. I care about God. I'm a theist. But what remains is all these years of, shall we say, anti-Israelism. It is very, very important. It's a different color. When I grew up in the United States, when I was little, there were two types of pistachio nuts. One had a white shell and the other was dyed red. But you know, you take the shell away, throw it away. One that's red, let's say communist, white, maybe let's say is rightist. Inside, it's the same thing. I'm afraid that we must, if we want to be honest with ourselves, realize, yes, we want Imam al to win, but we shouldn't think that overnight they're going to love us. I was deeply involved in the Turkish-Israel relationship when it was established way back when. Some of my Turkish friends, I mean, they're wonderful people. I always had the sense that underneath, they were doing it because they knew it was the right thing, not only to gain favor with the United States, they needed allies against the Arabs, who I talked about earlier in this talk, this whatever. And we shouldn't expect that, oh, we're going to go back to these great days of whatever, that they will be better for America, for Christian Europe, for Jewish Israel, no doubt. But it's not a panacea. It's not like some pill that...
It's not a quick fix.
No quick fix, exactly.
You know, Harold, listening to you in this fascinating experience of this podcast with you and giving an insight into Turkey that I think few people can do, which also has enormous ramifications in Israel. I think I want to take away this message and let me know if this is clear. Erdogan and others, including infiltrations into Europe, took place because they were willing to play the long game over time.
Yes.
And if Israel is looking for a short-term solution, we're going to lose. We have got to change our own mindset into understanding that things take place over time and be willing to put in the work it's going to take to both forge relationships, have defense pacts, and not expect an immediate love from our enemies in order to make a real change.
I couldn't agree with you more. I would say one other thing. The Middle East is filled with forces who hate each other. The difference between Jews when they argue, go into yeshiva, you see they're screaming and yelling, their hands in the air. They don't touch each other. They don't hit each other. In the Middle East, they have no mercy, no compassion. We can see, look at what they did in Syria. Look what happened in Iraq. Look what the Iranians have done to each other. They have no mercy and compassion between each other as we understand it. And all I'm saying is Israel has to understand this, as you said, Doron, from the long term. In the Middle East, patience is the key to everything. In America, as growing up, which both of us did, I want it now, and I will do whatever. It's instant gratification. It's the internet. It's cell phones. Yavash, yavash, shwaya, shwaya. Yavash, yavash in Persian. You can see Persian and Turkish are just different pronunciations.
Slowly, slowly.
Slowly, slowly. Do not think that you're going to have people who love you. And it's exactly the same thing in the United States. And here is the other thing. We need Turkish speakers. We need Persian speakers, Arabic speakers who know the culture, not just the language. And they didn't look in dictionaries to get translations of words. They've been out into the field and they understand how these people think and apply it to the policy decisions that we here in Israel, the United States, wherever. The Russians are good at this. The Chinese are even better.
Harold Rhode, thank you so much for your insights, both on Turkey and on Israel. And we take these lessons to heart. Thank you so much. To all of our listeners and all of our viewers, thank you for tuning into the True East podcast. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week.